A badge of honor. Police officers and first responders wear badges to let their communities know they are here to protect and serve. But that's not how it feels today, and the stress of the job is taking its toll, taking lives through suicide and post-traumatic stress injury. A Badge of Honor podcast features the cast of the same name, Sam Horwitz and John Salerno. Sam, John, and the team offer the first responders workshops through their critical incident stress management teams and mental health liaisons to offer state-certified T-COLE credit programs that save lives. It's time to smash through the stigma. It's time to heal from your injury, and it's time to back our blue. Welcome to A Badge of Honor podcast. Here are your hosts, Sam Horwitz and John Salerno.
Hey, welcome to A Badge of Honor podcast with John and Sam, powered by the OBBM network. Man, Sam, I don't know how you're doing right now, but I got to admit I'm a little hurting after yesterday's Super Bowl. Man, what a terrific game. I'm sure a lot of people are feeling the pain today.
The end of the day.
they're feeling the pain today, but the anxiety and the stress they were feeling yesterday, because that was an intense excuse me. Still getting over cold. That was an intense game yesterday. So that brings on a lot of different stresses for different people. So if you have different trigger warnings throughout the game, you should learn how to handle those stresses prior to the game. I've had my share of breaking TVs through anger management, but I've seen a lot of YouTube videos today on people smashing their TVs or breaking tables because a ball was missed or a touchdown occurred. Man, wow. We got to bring it down. It's not healthy. It's not mentally healthy.
Well, I mean, there's stress and anxiety in everything. I would say that's a little extreme for football. Maybe, I can just see the comments going crazy. Like, what do you know, Sam, about football? All I'm saying is like what you said. It's a football game. I mean, maybe you put a lot of money. I don't know. That could cause stress, right?
Yep,
the gambling, and we've seen that. We've talked about the gambling addiction that is on the increase. And our guest tonight she deals with trauma, stress, and anxiety. Not going to ask her if any of her clients today came in talking about smashing TVs with football, but it really is, you have to be aware of what you do and how your body responds when things like your team doesn't win. But
there was one video.
Seriousness, it's deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
In all seriousness, it's much deeper than that. Your response is coming from something maybe that has happened over the course of your life, whether depending on what the career that you're in. We obviously talk about first responders because we are a first responders network. We're bringing you everything related to first responders. So without further ado, let's bring in our guest, Dr. Brooke Bartlett from the West Coast, California. Hey, Dr. Brooke, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Excited to be here.
You're from the West Coast. You're from the West Coast. Are you nursing your wounds? Are you a 49ers fan?
I am about as far away from being a 49ers fan as possible. I was very happy. Well, I can't say very happy because I'm not a huge Chiefs fan either. But if I had to choose, I would choose the Chiefs over the 49ers. So
people are leaving our stream in droves. We got 0.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. But before we kind of get into like the stress and the trauma and anxiety of how we start off the show, just tell everybody watching and listening now. Hello, Instagram Live. Hello, if you're watching live on Roku or our newest channel, A Badge of Honor TV on Rumble. Rumble. We're rumbling in the jungle. So thank you, OBBN, for making that happen. Dr. Brooke, just let everybody know like your background and why you decided to go this avenue, because you work with a lot of first responders and veterans.
Yeah, so let's take you all the way back to when I was just a wee girl.
Oh, there's only 50 minutes. No, I'm kidding.
It all started back.
Way back.
So I come from a family with some military in it. I'd always been very, very much drawn and fascinated by warfare and how warfare trauma affects people. So even when I was like 9 or 10 years old, I would be buying like Ken Burns Vietnam War books. Like that's what I was reading, and my parents were like, "What the hell is wrong with her?" Like, buy like chicken soup for the soul or something, kid. Like, what's wrong with you? So I was always very much drawn towards that. I've always been a very patriotic person. I'm very, very, very grateful for the people who I always remind people they don't only risk and sacrifice their lives, but they sacrifice their minds sometimes too. So I knew I wanted to become a psychologist. My former life, I was an athlete and was hoping that I could become a professional athlete, but my body had a different plan. So once I retired early due to injuries, I was like, all right, time to go become a psychologist, and was on the track to become a military trauma psychologist. I was working at the National Center for PTSD, got my master's degree doing research with combat veterans. And when I went to get the PhD, it takes about 12 to 15 years to become a psychologist. When I started that road, we had just made a connection with the fire and the police department, a couple of the largest agencies in the country. And the fire department was only one of 3 at the time that had staff psychologists. So I spent all 6 years of my doctoral trajectory specializing and working with first responders. And right off the bat, I fell in love with it. I was like, wow, this is very similar. These two populations are very similar. And actually a lot of the first responders were former military as well. So yeah, I really just immersed myself in it. I was on call 24/7 there at the critical incidents. I was there at the funerals. I was there at the promotions. I also have a big research background. So I was doing a lot of research across the nation, collecting data on first responders and kind of going from that scientifically informed approach. So yeah, when I finished the long road to becoming licensed, I immediately opened up my own business and have been serving first responders and military through that as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Well needed. It's well needed.
And your focus is, it's generally you see clients from all different backgrounds, but your focus is that trauma, stress, and anxiety. And how have you seen? We'll just say over the past 4 years, basically since that big sickness thing. We don't want to get taken down, our broadcast, so we got to be careful with the way we say it. But how have you seen the stress and the anxiety? Has it increased for first responders, or is it not? Did it increase, decrease, increase again, or is it kind of all over the place?
Significant increase, and that has maintained. Like a very, very significant increase in, honestly, just poor mental health, poor functioning. There's a lot of different factors that went into that, from policy and legislation changes, and just being exposed to, but the population itself got mentally sicker. And so first responders are responding to that more. There's more overdose, there's more opiate addiction, there's more homelessness, there's more all of that. So having to consistently be chronically exposed to all that, even at a higher level, I think has contributed a lot to that as well.
So is that the vicarious or secondary trauma, as we like to? Well, I guess that's what it's called clinically. Not what John and I like to call it. But, So it's kind of twofold, because, well, it's more than that. So you got the policy changes that came along, shift work change. Everybody was on 12s. Then being immersed in it. So the secondary trauma. It sounds like, and we've talked to other guests, where it's like the departments, the agencies, they didn't move with the expectations that were being laid upon the men and women out there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, I'll comment on technically, it's not even considered secondary trauma. It's primary trauma. So anytime you're exposed, even if your life is not at risk, or you're not at risk of bodily harm or anything, being chronically exposed to witnessing and seeing these things is considered trauma in and
Yeah.
of itself. And I think that's important for first responders to know that. I work with a lot of first responders who are like, how could I be experiencing post-traumatic stress? Like, none of that is considered, like, that doesn't really even count. That's not even that big of a deal, that stuff I was dealing with. So I shouldn't even be struggling right now. But that in and of itself is actual trauma too. And has the same impact as, we'll call it, the big traumas. Like, I ran into a burning building, or I was involved in an officer involved shooting, or those types of things are, of course, also trauma. But responding, I mean, I hear all the time, responding to the same person that this is the 6th time that they've overdosed, and you have to, Narcan them, that wears and tears too.
Let me ask something. And this is happening, I guess, countrywide. The landscape has changed. The environment has changed throughout cities, right? California, beautiful state, right? But to see the homeless population, you brought up homeless. You see that every day on patrol. That has a mental impact. It's a visual trauma that you are seeing each and every. You can be driving down instead of watching the waves, now you're seeing an increase in homeless activity. You're seeing an increase in drug overdose with fentanyl. We're seeing that happen with the officers in New York as well. The local landscape has changed, so it's not so much of a happy Times Square. Look at the bright lights. Now it's all dark and dreary and sad.
Yeah.
You think that plays a big impact in their emotional day-to-day
100%.
stress?
And what I'm really seeing a pickup in, and this is related to trauma as well, but is what's known as moral injury, and the impact that has. Because again, I hear from first responders all the time in the therapy room things that they won't express out loud in the public, but that so many are struggling with the same exact thing. For example, if we're talking about that homeless example of, like, they're too embarrassed to say that is impacting them, that so and so that they just responded to for the 5th time who had overdosed, that they actually care about that, but that it's starting to have an impact on them. Like, no, I don't truly care about this human being itself, but yeah, having to witness someone in such a desperate state all the time, overdosing, and just in this case, like, say they're homeless and they're just completely dilapidated, and having to be exposed to that all the time, and knowing that there's not really anything else I can do, starts to chip away and have an effect on people. And I think that the moral injury side of things has really started to increase as well.
I was reading about moral injury the other day. I think we got to take our first break, but we're going to come back and explore this topic even more. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back.
Move freely, America, without medical restrictions or penalty. Without medical freedom legislation in place, our rights and freedoms are one vote away from being dissolved. Move freely, America, with one voice, without fear of retribution, achieving a common goal: medical freedom. We the people make our voices heard by connecting with state legislators and engaging a constitutionally compliant medical Bill of Rights for all citizens. Individually, change is improbable, but as an aggregate, attainable. It's time to act with one voice. My voice.
And my voice.
And my voice.
And my voice.
To protect our freedom, creating one voice that cannot be ignored. This requires your voice, too. Move Freely America. Go to movefreelyamerica.org to find a chapter near you. Plug in, donate, and help our legislators defend our God-given rights under the Constitution. Move Freely America. My voice.
And my voice.
And together with your voice, we're one voice that cannot be ignored. Donate today. MoveFreelyAmerica.org.
Hey, welcome back to a Badge of Honor podcast with John and Sam and Dr. Brooke Bartlett with the Center of Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress. And that's what we're tapping into right now. Before we left and took a break, we're talking about the moral stresses that impact our first responders on a daily basis. Everybody has those traumas, the fires, the death scenes, and everything else. But how about the visual impact on a day-to-day basis. It's almost like a hospice nurse. There is nothing you can do. There's things you can't change, right? But you still have to go to work, and you see these people, and you want to help, but it's just physically or impossible to do, right? Because in hospice, they're gonna pass away, and you can be there for them. What do our first responders do when they're out of options?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so moral injury is basically, it's defined as when we perceive in some way that we've perpetrated a value or moral that we hold. But the common misconception is that it's only related to like actual wrongdoing. Like, for example, like I do something, like it was most commonly tied to killing in combat, right? We could see how that could be morally injurious, right? But moral injury encompasses a lot more than that. And I really see it among first responders. It's so incredibly prevalent, but not really well understood. And it comes up in a lot of those scenarios where they're kind of put in a position where they don't really have much control, right? There's not much that they can do. And like I said in that example, even though, okay, I don't like personally care for this individual that just overdosed again, it still has an impact. It's still hard for me to see someone suffering.
Still a human being. It's
Right.
basic humanity,
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. Yeah. And that really plays in. And it doesn't even need to be, there's a lot of first responders who experience moral injury based on, certain protocols or legislation that they have to follow, right? I mean, a friend of mine was recently taught, who's a sergeant at a police department, was talking about, the limited pursuit legislation that got passed, which really put them in a bind on who they could pursue in different cases, and, not being able to pursue someone who they knew was actively committing horrific domestic violence against his partner, and he couldn't pursue him, right? And that's morally injurious to them, right? So it's super, super prevalent among first responders. And there's so many situations that I think have increased since then, right? Since the sickness, as you put it.
But you hit a great topic, and a lot of our first responders, and I'll say it, are handcuffed. So the job that they originally took to help and be part of a solution to a community outcry, they can't do anymore because policy, procedure is handcuffing them from their job. And that on a whole other level is stressful, So they're getting hit in every different direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't it also because like you shared very quickly before the break, is like we tend to minimize, like if I talk about the all of the deaths that I'm seeing that are not from gunshots, but just from being homeless or some other reason, that we minimize it. That shouldn't bother me. So
I'm not bother you. Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about it. Whereas inside you, it's pinging everything. And I think that's where, that moral injury and it kind of skirts a line, and please, we're always open to, John and I are open to being corrected. But at first it seemed that some organizations that were focusing on moral injury, like they didn't want to acknowledge that PTSD exists, or that it's micro traumas or multiple traumas causing that this anxiety and stress response in a first responder, that it's something called moral injury. Can you have one without the other, or are they often linked? How does that work?
That's a great question. So here's the thing. Moral injury is very commonly also present among people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. However, they are two distinct, separate things. Moral injury is distinct from post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, someone could be experiencing moral injury unrelated to how we define trauma, right? Like seeing someone dying, or like I said, running into a burning building. Moral injury is very much associated, not necessarily with the trauma itself, but it's associated with that perception of some kind of value or boundary, moral boundary was crossed, right? Either I did it by like either I crossed that boundary, something I did, but in a lot of cases, a lot of my first responders experience moral injury because there's something I should have done or could have done that I didn't do. And that also crossed my moral boundary.
Oh, that sounds like survivor's guilt a little
It is.
bit.
There's a lot of survivor's guilt.
Now, let me ask something. You can get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you get diagnosed with moral? I mean, and what's funny is we'll call
injury.
PTSD a disorder,
Yeah.
but we'll call the moral aspect an injury. I mean, and you said they're different, but can you be diagnosed with one and not the other, or both, or how does that work?
Yeah. So as of right now, you cannot be diagnosed with moral injury because
Okay.
it doesn't.
It has to have a D to be in the DSM.
Moral injury disorder.
It has to be billable.
A D. Yeah. And they I'm all the research is coming out, and it's presumed that they're going to add moral injury to the DSM in the upcoming revision, which probably will be in about 5 years or so. But it is not acknowledged as in the diagnostic section as of right now. But I am pretty confident it will eventually be added. But unfortunately, I think that's also what contributes to it not really being as acknowledged. A lot of people think that moral injury is post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's not. Again, it is distinct. I mean, the way and again, I'm saying the scientists were able to, it's a pretty new, even though people have been experiencing it based on warfare for so long, that it's newly acknowledged in the last 20 years or so. And it was actually researchers running a study with Vietnam combat veterans at the VA about 20 years ago or so, treating them for post-traumatic stress disorder. And they were tracking them as they went along. And by the end, when they were done with that treatment, they no longer met criteria for PTSD, but they were still suffering from debilitating symptoms. And they were like, what is this that we're seeing? And they started to realize that these symptoms were directly attached to what they perceived as things that they had done or not done that were morally violating to them. And the number one symptom, there's a lot of different symptoms, but the number one symptom that always accompanies moral injury is guilt. Always, always, always.
Yeah. That's
Mm-hmm.
a big one. That's a big one for us in the first responder community. So we're going to take our next break. When we come back, I want us to hold that thought, because as you're working with the first responders and they talk about survivor's guilt and, being trained to save lives when they couldn't, and we'll talk about it when we come back, folks. Stay tuned.
Interested in starting a podcast or TV show? Worried about what you'll say and how to keep it engaging? Think you'd like to be a guest on podcast, radio, or TV shows? Hi, I'm Susan Hamilton, owner and founder of OBBM Network, and I would like to invite you to an OBBM media training to get the tools you need for a relaxed and polished performance you'll be proud to share. Our specialized training techniques include role play, voice training, and everything you need to deliver a confident, clear, and engaging interaction. Go to offbeatbusiness.com. Go to the calendar and register for a training that's convenient for you. Dates available now, 214-714-0495.
Hey, welcome back to A Badge of Honor podcast with John and Sam. And we welcome back Dr. Brooke Bartlett with the Center for Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress. And we talk about the stress onion or the trauma onion, and it's got so many different layers. And every week we just keep peeling stuff back and learning more about what impacts our first responders' minds, our mental judgment, and now our moral injuries. And all these pieces are part of a bigger puzzle that really cause so much stress along our first responders, and it almost debilitates them through normal life. And that's where Dr. Brooke comes in. She's the one that's going to help you identify these things. Because if we go through life not knowing what this is, or not knowing why we act the way we act, that again could be another stress. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I doing this? So Dr. Brooke is the one that says, all right, here are the puzzles. It's not your fault. It's normal. You can fix it. Right, Doc?
Yeah, absolutely. So before we took a break, I'll just use me as an example. 9/11. We were trained to save lives. That's what we did. And, we watched not only people that we worked with, but strangers. Lots of people died, couldn't do anything, couldn't save them. I talk in our workshops about a young man that we helped rescue from a school. He passed away during an elective surgical procedure, had nothing to do with 9/11. And I was just yanked back. Like it shouldn't have happened. I saved him. He should be alive. All that kind of thing. When you group that into, can you, because you said guilt's always part of moral injury. That survivor's guilt is also part of a PTS diagnosis. So how would you separate the two?
So one of the criterion for post-traumatic stress disorder is what they call pervasive negative emotions, which could encompass guilt, shame, disgust, things like that. Moral injury is primarily a guilt, or that's the primary symptom, but it's a little bit different it has a little bit of a different flavor from post-traumatic stress disorder, because when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, we're talking about someone's change in their view of themselves, the world, people around them, and they typically start to engage in behaviors to avoid things, people, places, things, thoughts, feelings that remind them of their trauma. Moral injury is very much more so associated with things like, I should have done this, I could have done that. If I hadn't done this, then maybe they'd still be alive. Or if I was only a better father or mother or friend or this or that, this would be better. So it's very much centered on that moral, internal moral code, and very much centered just specifically on the person, as opposed to someone who, let's say, is sexually assaulted by a male, and they develop PTSD and they start avoiding interactions with males, or they'll change their work schedule so that they're not around males, right? And so again, there's definitely overlap between the two, but someone can no longer meet criteria for PTSD if they go through PTSD treatment and still be experiencing moral injury that needs to be addressed. And that's something I experience a lot with the individuals I see in therapy is, if they come in with both, we'll address the PTSD first. If we notice they're still experiencing some of that guilt, and let's say it's survivor's guilt, why am I still here when my buddy is not? We address that as well.
How do you tap into that? Yeah, I was trying to figure out how to formulate this. Like John LaRocchia, when we're talking about 9/11, right? John with Laugh Saves Lives, switched tours. So he's had survivor's guilt. He switched tours with his best friend on that day, and his best friend died. Should have been him. He was home. So he experienced that survivor's guilt. Mm-hmm. How do we tap into it? And what are some of the common treatments to show that, this wasn't your fault? This is just God's plan, God's will. How do we look at it on a grand picture,
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is an evidence-based treatment developed specifically for moral injury by some colleagues actually here in San Diego. It's called trauma-informed guilt reduction therapy, also known as TRIGGER. Now, it has the word trauma in it, but again, someone doesn't necessarily need to have experienced, we'll call it a big T trauma, like life-threatening or anything like that. Some people I work with a lot of first responders that experience moral injury. Let's say, I call it balancing first responder family versus civilian family, where they're trying to be a good mother, father to their family at home. But the job obviously makes it really difficult to always be fully available, and they start to experience moral injury, trying to balance those two things out, right? A big part of treating moral injury, there's two big parts. One, I go in and systematically, using the evidence-based techniques, we what's called evaluate the guilt. Okay. It involves a lot of psychoeducation about what guilt is, what adaptive guilt is, what maladaptive guilt is, different types of guilt. Survivor's guilt is one of those. And then we start to really systematically evaluate that person's guilt. So for example, let's say, in the example that you gave, right? I forgot the exact details, but you're saying, his friend responded.
tours.
Sorry?
He switched tours on 9/11 with somebody.
Okay. Switch tours. There you go. So switch tours. So the moral injury is that I shouldn't be here. He should. And probably kind of a sense of like, I'm responsible for his death, because if I hadn't switched tours, then I would still be here. What we see in moral injury pretty commonly is a couple different things. One is called hindsight bias. Have you heard of that before?
No.
So it's when we take what we know now and then we judge ourselves based on that information as if we knew it then, right? So now he knows that there was going to be a terrible terrorist attack that occurred on that day. But he's judging himself as if he made a decision to just switch tours anyways, potentially knowing that something horrific, one of the most horrific historical events occurring was going to happen. Today, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an example of hindsight bias. So what we start to go in is really start to have them systematically start to identify, take a step back and objectively identify the facts, the evidence, the context behind that, right? We also really target what's known as justification bias, which is basically when we take a terrible outcome and then we kind of in some way find a way to direct us to that outcome. So the death of this individual, that we've created some kind of path to, I am directly responsible for the death of this individual, as if I caused it, as if I had intention to cause the death of this individual. Now, you and I, the three of us here, can sit back and use this example, and we know objectively, of course, he's not responsible for the death, right? Of course not. Of course, he didn't do anything. Of course, if he had even a semblance of potential information that something like this could happen, I'm sure he would have just stayed on shift and right. But that he's somehow created a path in his brain to, I'm directly responsible for this. So we really evaluate intent, actual responsibility. And again, we do that by having the individual step back. There's worksheets to complete in session, at a session. It's a lot of repetition of evaluating the guilt. So that's one major part of treating moral injury. And it's super, super important because our brains function in a way where it'll function as efficiently as possible. And if we have landed on this thought of and belief that I am responsible for his death because I switched shifts last minute, and we don't address that and we don't open it up, and like you said, peel back the layers and really look at it objectively, that is just going to become a stronger and stronger and stronger belief. And it is just going to weigh someone down. And as I'm sure it did him for many years.
But it almost seems, the way the brain works, it almost makes it like you're justifying the actions, right? To, although it's guilt-based, you're justifying the actions of moving yourself closer to that trauma to relieve yourself of some guilt. It's like a double-edged sword sometimes.
So that's a great point too. I don't have an exact term for this. I haven't trademarked a term for this, but I talk about this all the time when I'm talking about moral injury. But one thing about moral injury too, especially with a lot of my first responders and combat veterans, is they don't want to let go of the guilt. I call it using guilt as a function for something else, right? Because it's almost like if I stop feeling guilty about this, that in and of itself is a bad thing. That means I hear a lot. That means I don't care. That means I'm a bad brother, friend, this, that. That means I might forget about them, right? And so it's like, I need to keep this close to me because this is what's holding me together right now, even though it's not in a way, but it's what's standing in between me and this fear that it means that if I don't have this guilt, it's going to lead to all these other things.
Wow, this is fascinating. Hey, if you're just joining us, we're having an awesome conversation with Dr. Brooke Bartlett about moral injury, about PTS, how the brain works and holds on to things. And just like right here, we got to let that shit go. We'll be right back after these messages.
Look, when you need to respond to an aggressive situation to protect yourself, your family, or your property, understanding your firearm and legal position are critical. Officers know your skills are only as good as your commitment to training. So know what you're doing. So when you're in a vulnerable situation, we can count on your response. Whether you're a beginner or a licensed gun carrier, Carry in Texas offers basic firearms training, Texas permitless carry courses, license to carry, and basic 2A courses so you can understand the responsibilities, situational awareness, and learn the technical skill required when you carry your firearm. Go to carryintexas.com to find the right course for you. Join me, former United States Secret Service agent Samantha Horwitz, on the range for beginner basics, LTC prep, and range practice. Go to carryintexas.com today. That's carryintexas.com.
Hey, welcome back to a Badge of Honor podcast with John and Sam and Dr. Brooke Bartlett with the Center of Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress. I do want to touch on one other thing, was the holistic areas that are on your website, because a lot of first responders go, I am not sitting down with a counselor. They're going to put me on medication. They're going to pop me full of pills. And that's not always the case either, right?
No. And I strongly urge people to run away if they go see someone and they immediately just tell them to go on medication. Now, I should say this, in instances of severe mental illness, which is like psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, those require medication. But if we're talking about anxiety, depression, stress, PTSD, I'm very much a skills before pills person. And sometimes it's used as an adjunctive. Sometimes individuals benefit from, let's say, a booster, we'll call it, of, some medication while they're going through therapy. But medication alone is going to do as much for you as taking high blood pressure medication while continuing to eat donuts and, 12 eggs a day, so. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
There's a time and a place.
Yes.
Yes.
Moderation.
Yeah. So your work with first responders goes outside of your office as well. On your website, you talk about working with agencies to create, to get in front of what their folks are going to experience and see over a career, and in that you're going to reach those that have been serving for a while. What kind of things do you discuss with the agencies to make that holistic approach by option? Yeah,
so I think a lot of agencies, and I think a lot of us as individuals, including myself, sometimes function like from a reactive approach. Like we wait until. Am I allowed to swear on this?
Yes.
Okay. We wait until shit hits the fan, and then we got to do something about it, right? Or we wait until we hit rock bottom, and then we got to do something about it, right? And the idea is that we want agencies to start functioning from the perspective of, like you said, getting out in front of it. I think about it as 3 lines of defense, right? The third line of defense is that reactive portion, right? Crisis, people who are in crisis, things like that. And that's needed in every department too, by the way. This is your strike teams, chaplains, things like that. When terrible crises happen, we need that as well. But some agencies don't have anything aside from that third line. The first 2 lines of defense first line of defense is what I call prevention. It's, hey, how about we go in the approach of let's keep healthy people healthy. What can we do to keep our staff, our personnel, our employees healthy, both physically and mentally, right? What can we start to put in place now to make that happen? And the second line of defense is early intervention. So what can we start to put in place so that if and when our employees, our staff are starting to notice, maybe I'm kind of not doing as well anymore, nothing's hit the fan yet or anything, that I can recognize that. And then I have resources and places to go to stop that snowball from continuing to roll, right? And because that's what happens is what we're seeing so much. I mean, it seems like every day now I'm waking up to more news that another first responder has died by suicide. And that is an accumulation, right? I know you guys had Dr. Olivia on last week, and I'm sure you talked a lot about suicide, and I'm really fond of her work and the idea that it's not impulsive. It's not just this one thing. It is an accumulation of things, right? So when I'm working with agencies, it's really about how do we set things? What can we do? What are you willing to do to set things in place to keep your personnel healthy and to allow them resources to intervene early before shit hits the fan.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And peer support is definitely one of those things.
Yep.
You have that on your website as well. You talk about peer support. It's not just a matter of like you go peer support, you know, you have to have the right recipe to make it work for your agency. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, peer support is I every single agency, small, large, in between, should have a peer support team. And it's really important to have a clear set of policies and guidelines when setting up your peer support team, and making sure your peer support team has the proper training so that they understand their role. Their role is not to fix, right? Their role is to support and to be there, to be a liaison if someone does need more help, and say, I'm here. I may not know how to solve your problem right now, but I'm here with you. And I want to try and find someone with you who can help you. Right. That's a major, major aspect in peer support programming. And I find that there's sometimes agencies that have peer support programs that their peer supporters aren't really clear on what their role is, and they're burnt out because they're just kind of trying to put out fires all the time. And two, employees don't feel comfortable going to their peer supporters, right? They have a peer support program set up that people actually don't feel really comfortable utilizing. So when we're talking about proactive peer support, and there's a lot of different factors that go into that, but proactive peer support is peer support that's not just utilized when things are bad.
Right.
Immersed in the culture, immersed in the agency, right? So when I'm training and building peer support teams and I'm training peer supporters, we're talking about reaching out to people during good times too, normalizing talking about these things, right? Just really building a presence in that, of that connection, so that if someone was going to be struggling, that they'd be more likely to reach out to that person. And also, are you more likely to reach out to someone for help and say, look up the number? Okay, how exactly do I reach these peer supporters? Who are the peer supporters and how do I contact them? Probably not, right? And so
you're already stressed.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're not going to do research.
Exactly. Most of us would be deterred by that, right? Of like, how do I even do that? So proactive peer support is also about, like I said, immersing it in the culture, making it very clear to the whole department and the agency what peer support is, how to access them, confidentiality, and having the peer supporters also just be present and be reaching out for the good. I always say the good, the bad, and the in-between. It shouldn't also only be associated with like, that guy's seeking peer support. I wonder what's going on with him. Did you hear his wife's leaving him? Like, yeah, going through it.
Yeah.
Well,
Because we're good at the rumor mills and doing that as well. Hey, if you guys are just or if you guys are listening on your favorite podcast app, thank you very much for doing that. I have had Dr. Brooke's website up. So she's at the Center for Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress, and you can go direct to her website after the show it's Center TAS for Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress. So centertas.com or CenterTAS.
There you go. You said it right. Yeah. Center Taste, Center Test.
No, CenterTAS.
There you go.
So, this has been so eye-opening, and I'm going back to. We were talking about the moral injury and the way that our brain works, and things can kind of get stuck. And if we are telling ourselves that somehow we are responsible and we get stuck in that, is that like a new neural pathway that we're creating? Because our brains automatically go to the negative. Humans, that is our species. That's what we do. That's what we do. Not best, but we kind of do.
Yeah.
Because that's, we're always looking for the thing that's going to attack us at saber-tooth tiger. So is it a new neural pathway that's being created? And if we don't deal with that, that's where
that's a great question. So to answer your question with a yes or no, yes, if it's done enough. Right. Our brain, like you said, our brains are built to operate efficiently. And so it's like, for example, like say you got a new job and you're driving work and you have to look at maps to get there, right? Because you don't know how to get there. It's your first time. Maybe you use the maps the first few times, but after a while, you don't need to be as focused as to where you're turning or anything because it just becomes normal, right? Our brains do the same way with our patterns of thinking and what goes on in our thoughts. And so after a while, our brain will actually start to form certain connections, start to strengthen certain areas that maybe aren't really serving us so well. So if we're talking about, I have a pattern of just turning the blame on myself and thinking about myself and doing that will become a pattern because our brain actually starts to fire in that way. But here's the great news. We are all born with a superpower, okay? And it's called neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
Because even though our brain starts to build new connections and build those new neural connections or those neural connections that maybe like we're thinking negatively and we're blaming ourselves, we have moral injury and all this, our brain is actually also malleable. It is designed to change. And so we are capable of actually strengthening areas that have been lost. It's called functional and structural neuroplasticity. So our brain is actually capable of pruning away some of those connections that we don't actually want there anymore, and building newer, stronger connections that take its place. Just as we would, I use analogies and metaphors to physical things because I think we can more easily understand and relate to them. But when I broke my knee in half, I literally cracked my kneecap in half, had to be in a splint. I was atrophied, right? I had to rebuild the strength in my leg and the other areas of my body, by the way, that got weak because I wasn't able to operate properly. And it took a lot of work, but I was able to rebuild that. And our brain is the same way. Now, I also like to let individuals know that even though we're born with this superpower, it doesn't just happen on its own.
Right.
I can't break my knee and go, let's see what happens. Let's hope it heals. Right. So it takes repetition. It takes intention. It takes consistency. So intention, repetition, consistency over and over and over again. That's how we start to build those new neural connections. And so if we're talking about therapy, right? Therapy for, let's say, moral injury, these evidence-based treatments are designed to be very repetitive. They require a lot of work, right? I always tell people, you're with me, let's say 1 hour a week in the therapy room, but there's how many hours of the week? 160. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So most of the work's being done outside of this, right? It takes actually engaging in what we call the homework and doing these things and implementing them consistently to start seeing that change.
Yeah, and the change is remarkable. We got to take our last quick break. We'll be right back, Dr. Brooke.
To the Health Engineer Show, I'm Cliff Buckley, the health engineer right here on the Offbeat.
Hi, I'm Larry Cortez.
Hi, my name is Susan Hamilton, and you're watching Offbeat.
Hi, this is Doreen Milano. Welcome to Big Ideas Small Business, where we will talk to Terry Arjala.
Hey, welcome back to a Badge of Honor podcast with John and Sam and Dr. Brooke Bartlett. Before we are tapping into so many things that when we talk about removing the layers, and now we're talking about survivor's guilt, we're talking about moral injury, we're talking about PTSD, and all these things impact us no matter what field we're in. If we're in fire service, police service, or veterans, we can't deny ourselves saying this is not going to affect us, because it may not affect us right now, but later on down the road, 5-10 years after retirement, something's going to strike us. So it's very important to get the mental health treatment or the knowledge about this, throughout your career.
Mm-hmm. Be proactive with it. That inoculation that that Dr. Olivia talked about last week. Because if you're in front of it, it's almost like you can't say you didn't know. Mm-hmm. Right? After 5 years, this is kind of what it's going to look like. After 10 years, 15 years, and if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, Dr. Brooke Bartlett can be reached at, her website is Center TAS. That's center and then TAS for trauma, anxiety, and stress.com. CenterTAS.com. And you can reach out to her at her website, which is chock full of so much more information. But the ultimate important contact me button, because you can not only help the first responder to themselves, if they need trauma, maybe they don't need trauma, maybe they want to set up peer support because they don't have one. You can make that happen. And it's really about, let's get in front of this. Let's get into the departments. Let's get the departments on board for creating a healthy, positive environment for first responders to thrive. So not that we want to put people like Dr. Brooke out of business, because the research is there and we will always need people like Dr. Brooke, because John, like you said, we may not recognize it at 10 years. It may be after 25.
But we're growing. I mean, we're learning each and every day. I mean, every day we learn something new. So, the moral injury, it's basically this. I think this is the first time I've heard of it brought into moral injury, stated that way. So, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're learning is new. We've only scratched PTSD, maybe 5-10%. And we're continuing to grow and learn and gain in knowledge and heal people. But we just need more people on board to start gaining that same knowledge.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Brooke, where can people connect with you on social media?
Yeah, so my Instagram, Dr. Brooke PhD. So that's doctor spelled out, and then Brooke, BROOKE PhD on Instagram. I'm also on LinkedIn as Brooke Bartlett. But yeah, I recently got on Instagram a few months ago and have been really struggling through learning how to do all the social media stuff, but I'm making my way. And yeah, I post some content. I sometimes post clips of some, trainings and things that I give on there too, just, tidbits of information.
Well, that is awesome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I mean, oh my gosh, such incredible information. And reach out to Dr. Brooke if you want to find out more about moral injury, because it's real and it's very interesting to understand. Dr. Brooke, thank you. We will be in touch. Really appreciate you very much, all the work you do with our veterans, first responders, and family members.
Yeah, thank you both so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It was great being here.
Thank you.
You bet. We'll be in touch soon. Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Yeah, this was fantastic. Like we were talking, I just was reading about moral injury yesterday. And so I'm like, what is this? Recognizing, way back when I had treatment, I was like, nobody ever really talked about this, even though the research may have been being done, got to collect the numbers and stuff, but it is fascinating. And, just, we say it every week, you have to be aware of what's going on inside of you. When you realize something's off, even if it's just a little bit, you do something that is demanding that 99% of people can't do. That's being a first responder. So take care of yourself physically and mentally as well. So thank you again to Dr. Brooke for coming on. We have got so much going on. I'm just going to throw up our website, badgeofhonor.org, because that's where everything on the calendar is. We've got an event in Denton to round out this month. We've got events in March. So just go to badgeofhonor.org. You can click on events. We've got a first responder family event coming up. If you're local to the DFW area, you're going to want to check that out, especially if you're in the fire department. And then we've also got a unique workshop coming up with Our Watch, equine therapy. They're one of our partners, and you can find out more about that on our website as well. That's badgeofhonor.org. We want to say thank you, John and I, to everybody who tunes in each week. If this is your first time, welcome. If it's your first time watching us on Rumble TV, welcome. Roku, the same. We want to thank OBBM Network and everybody who's saying, hey, we want this content. Thank you so much for getting it out there. And hopefully we're making an impact. Don't be a stranger. Reach out if you need some assistance. Hit that like, hit that subscribe button on YouTube, that bell, ding, 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 so you can be alerted and get notified when we're going live. And John and I are all over the place on social media. The best place to to find us on all your favorite social media outlets. We're at A Badge of Honor. You can just search us up there, send us a message. We want to thank these guys right here, Carry the Load. If you don't know about Carry the Load, we are nonprofit partners in their Continuum of Care program, and Carry the Load is very generous in that they give back. It's a give back to us to be able to provide scholarships to our first responders to build that awareness piece that we are talking about tonight and that we talk about on every podcast, because it's really important. You have to be aware of what is going on when you answer the call to do a demanding job. So with that, thank you very much to all of our first responders out there. We are praying for you every single day. We understand, we get that it is really hard right now. Okay. Reach out. You've got thousands of people that are praying for you every day. So thank you for keeping our communities safe. To all of our veterans out there, thank you for what you did, for allowing us to do a show like this every week. To our active duty personnel fighting the good fight across the world, keeping our shores safe here at home, thank you. And with that, John, take us home.
And you said it best. One thing, just, if you could be anything in this world, man, basic humanity, just stay kind, and that will get you through the day. Peace.
Till next week, everybody. Take care.
A Badge of Honor podcast is produced for the OBBN Network podcast and protected under copyright law. For content permissions, please submit your request to abadgeofhonor.com on the content page. For OBBN Network programming information, please call 214-714-0495 today.